Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're in the traditional and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. So the first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. So moved by Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Ernst. Next would be the approval of the minutes. We don't have to on the agenda, but we can. Yeah, we don't have to on the agenda, I was told, my thing, because what do we do if we all vote no? What if we do if we all say no? So now we'll get to the approval of the minutes from the September 12th regular council meeting. Moved by Councillor Bertels, seconder by Councillor Halverson. All those in signify by saying aye or put your hand up. No. Okay. And now we're going to move on to the public input and question session. Everybody gets 3 minutes. You must state your name, and your questions or comments are basically directed to the chair. So first is Allison Strachan.
Hi, my name is Allison Strawn. I live at 46 Lawrence Street in the suburb of Newtown in the town of Lunenburg. I am here tonight to talk about a zoning issue that was brought to my attention by a resident on Green Street. I guess I call it Lower Green Street, the area of town that runs into Tannery Road. And I prepared something that I can give to the chair, and maybe it could be distributed to the rest of council. In the document, it just talks about Bill Plaskett's review of these buildings and you know, the historical facts that are involved with them. One was that the first mayor of Lunenburg lived in one of them. But the question I got from a resident is that they noticed in the spring of last year that their zoning changed from residential to general commercial, and that kind of took them by surprise. So I've got everything in there, and I guess I looked, thank you to Kayla for sending me the maps. My understanding, I think, is that the rezoning was done to reduce development agreements, applications, or variations. That's what I would assume it was done. And if you look at the definition of general commercial, it's intended to accommodate the traditional mixing of uses found in Old Town Lunenburg, including a wide range of commercial uses such as gas stations, and auto repair shall not be permitted. So that's fine. But the bottom line is that the zoning now, that brings me here, is bringing it into line with an Old Town understanding of general commercial use. And this area of town does not fall under the same protections that Old Town is for architectural history or changes. There's some concern that if somebody wanted to pay $600,000 or $700,000 for a house down there, they could level it and put in a grocery store or whatever. I don't think that that's the ultimate goal, but I guess the window is there since it doesn't have the protections of the conservation district, even though it's applying the, anyway, I think you understand what I'm saying, but if you could share that with staff and at some point, let me know and I can tell the person that is asking the question.
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. Thank you. And next on the list is Robert Young.
No, now I'm on. Okay. Robert Young, 225 Dufferin Street, Lunenburg. Anyways, I'm gonna make a few comments on some of the things that were brought up this summer of how the council was acting. And the one thing I'll deal with tonight is the rate of pay that councils receive. Apparently in 2014, they decided to go to cost of living of the actual cost of living and increase it at that rate. And when you look what you'll be getting in November, will be around 7.5%, and yet the workers are only getting 2.75%, I think. So that policy should be changed. It wouldn't take very long to change it, and you could, bring it in line with what workers the increase that they receive, which is the way it was when I was on the council. And I thought that was better than, I don't know if it's a perfect idea, but it's better than the system you have now. And I would like to have the decision made fairly promptly. You don't have to wait till the Leafs win the Stanley Cup in order to do it. So anyways, that's the end of my presentation. If you're going in camera tonight, I don't know if you want to deal with that tonight or some later date, but hopefully before November 1st. That's all for now then. Okay.
Thank you, Robert. I think history showed they brought in like an independent committee around 2014 when they set that, and it's an old policy done in 2014. And I think the reason it was done was to take the setting of wages for counselors out of their own hands when they were negotiating with staff, because technically they were negotiating for their own raises as well. And quite honestly, I doubt that anybody at that time ever saw the CPI getting to 7%, but it has. So I think we have some old policies in place. I was talking to Kayla today, and maybe we can get staff to go back and review the whole honorarium bylaw and come back to the table. But thank you for that. I'm sure we'll look into it. Thank you.
Blaming you guys for this. It's just things that happen as you go through life and you have to make corrections. That's all.
No, thank you very much, Robert. Thank you. So next on the agenda, we have a presentation from Capacity Building for Sustainable and Inclusive Development of Nova Scotia's offshore wind resource. Christy Chaplin, Net Zero Atlantic.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for a few minutes of your attention this evening. The not-for-profit that I work for is committed to supporting the transition to carbon neutrality throughout Atlantic Canada. What that can mean is that we would dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then devise ways of capturing and storing any sort of emissions that we can't actually live without as a species. I'm sure everyone's heard about climate change concerns. So that's what we're tackling. And I'm here to speak specifically about an opportunity that Nova Scotia can consider and our legislators are considering for offshore wind development. I try not to speak about it as if it is a certainty, but there is a lot of momentum, partly accelerated by international global affairs and interest in Europe in finding new energy sources. Next. And this is probably not a surprise to you, but I presented a couple of graphs that illustrate our target of 2050 of zero emissions. Our emissions were increasing up until 2005 and began to decrease, and they are trending really nicely, but we really do have a long way to go. So an important first step is to consider where are they coming from. In the case of Nova Scotia, most of our emissions are associated with electricity generation, followed by transportation and heating for buildings. So it's a very widely accepted strategy, and you're probably well aware of it. If we can reduce the emissions associated with our electricity generation and electrify transportation and heating, we can make a huge step in the right direction by doing those things. Next slide. And I apologize, this is going to be really difficult to read, but the pie chart on the left illustrates the sources that we're currently using to produce electricity, which are very substantially fossil fuel based. There's provincial and federal legislation that is going to squeeze a change in that sense. But I'd like to take a look at things in terms of what the range of options present. And that very illegible graph has two sections. There are lists of the different generating technologies that are well established. Nuclear, I know, is at the top because I can remember it, followed by onshore wind and offshore wind. Coal-fired is definitely at the bottom of both groupings. So on the top is the range if we're in a high emitting scenario, and on the bottom is a low emitting scenario. And to help you make sense out of that, you could put all of the same amount of steel and concrete into a generator and situate it far from a fuel source, or far, in a place that doesn't have a lot of solar or wind. And so, depending on where a generator is located, you'll either have higher or lower emissions per kilowatt hour. Did that make any sense? So you put the same solar panel, you build a solar panel, comes out of the factory, and you have a set number of emissions that went into the glass and the steel and the copper. If you put that in Arizona and you put the sister panel in Nova Scotia, you'll get more kilowatt hours out of the panel in Arizona than you would in Nova Scotia. So your emissions per kilowatt hour are going to be higher for a solar panel in Nova Scotia than Arizona. And then the same thing happens with wind. You build the turbine, and if you put it in a place with a moderate amount of wind, emissions per kilowatt hour will be high. In the case of coal, you might be transporting the fuel a further distance, or you might be using coal that contains more particulate and more pollutants. And so you would have a higher emissions per kilowatt hour, depending on the fuel source, as well as the distance. So I realize that's really dense. I've been working really hard to try to understand many, many different permutations of this opportunity. And I apologize if I do an information dump. I'm going to try really hard not to. I am excited about it. And I don't have a lot of minutes here, but again, I really appreciate your time. Next slide. I did not want to be remiss, because I will speak about the potential impacts or the likely impacts of offshore wind development if it occurs on ecosystems, because there will be implications. I just also wanted to mention that there's a big price to pay for doing nothing and status quo. The oceans are the biggest carbon sink on the planet, and they're also the biggest heat sink on the planet. And we're seeing sort of devastating implications from those already. Next slide. This is my favorite side. I wish it was bigger, but to someone like me who's lived most of her life in Nova Scotia, it's almost inconceivable that there are places in the world that have practically no wind. On the smaller map in the bottom, you can see that essentially in equatorial areas, the coloring on the map is either light blue or dark blue. And that means that the average wind speed on an annual basis is close to 0 meters per second. Whereas in the purple areas, including Nova Scotia, Atlantic Canada, the eastern seaboard of the US, purple means there's a lot of wind. The average wind speed offshore in Nova Scotia is 10 meters per second. So at this point, that resource is untapped. We have never had an offshore wind industry. We have experience with onshore wind that we can lean on, and we can also lean on the insights gained in Northern Europe, where they've had an industry for approximately 30 years. Next. Something important to help put things in perspective is that these developments are really big. The minimum viable size for an offshore wind development is approximately 1.5 to 3 gigawatts of generating capacity. To put it in context, all of the generating capacity at Nova Scotia Power is approximately 3 gigawatts. So the minimum viable size for one development is going to be comparable to all the generating capacity we have. What that means is our transmission system, our grid infrastructure is not only privately owned, and we can't fully make decisions about where the electrons will come from, but it's also not to scale for initial development. And so this development is likely to include energy exports. And it will remain to be seen how many of those electrons go to our grid. The exports could either be in the form of electricity, and the obvious market is the US, but we need grid infrastructure for that. The other form the energy could take would be what are called green fuels or e-fuels for electricity. So it's possible to synthesize things like e-diesel, e-gas, e-kerosene, or hydrogen using renewable energy. Hydrogen is the one that's getting a lot of attention these days. And there were a couple of proposals that went very quickly through environmental assessments for hydrogen facilities in Campground. I meant to ask early on, how many people are following offshore wind media coverage in Nova Scotia? Oh, well, yay. But I hope you will now. I hope you will after this. So hydrogen getting a lot of attention. It's very energy intensive. It's not particularly efficient, but they're working on efficiency improvements. It uses a lot of water, and hydrogen is extremely elusive. It's really hard to keep in a bottle. It's the smallest atom known on Earth. So what typically happens is that it's bound with nitrogen and turned into ammonia. Ammonia is a very widely used commodity in the international market with a lot of different potential applications, including energy use. I should have said earlier, one of the big downfalls about renewable energy that you're probably all aware of is that it isn't necessarily produced when we want to have electricity. So having some storage is really essential to integrating more renewable energy. Next slide. I hope I don't run out of time just yet. Am I okay? Okay. I wanted to make you aware that there are essentially two different types of turbines, some that are fixed to the bottom of the ocean, offshore wind turbines rather, some that are floating. And it's typically shallower water where the fixed bottom is used, but it also depends on the subsea geology, whether the piles can be driven. But it has been preferred because it tends to be a little less costly to deploy. Floating offshore wind turbines tend to require more local labor for those who'd be interested in economic development implications. Better keep going. An important consideration is the end of useful life, and turbines themselves are all very well, there's good systems in place for recycling just about everything except the blades. But there is emerging technology where they're producing blades using resins that are designed to be recycled. So when the blade has been overly stressed and needs to be replaced, the materials can be dissolved and filtered and put into new blades. And I like mentioning things like this. Decision makers are not going to listen to me, but they're going to listen to groups of people and perhaps to municipal councils. And this is the sort of thing that we might, as a community, be putting forward as something that we want if there's development here. Next slide. So we do know that there are impacts on biodiversity, there are impacts on creatures that fly, birds and bats, there are impacts on marine ecosystems. Some of them are bad and some of them are good, and there are mitigation strategies that can help reduce those impacts. And those are things that we also want to be aware of, but I can't possibly cover in 2 more minutes. By building our knowledge, and I'd be happy to come back if people want to hear more. And also we'll be offering bigger, longer sessions in libraries around the province where people can ask more questions. And what I'm hoping is build the discussion and build participation in the decisions that are very likely to be made in the coming months. But we would be watching for things like underwater noise, migration paths, reproductive seasons for species, and you can develop best practices and mitigation practices based on that kind of information. Some things are much better known than others. Things like emissions, we know a lot about. Ecological and ecosystem impacts, much tougher. And economic impacts are also not something you can put a number on right now. But certainly if development proceeds, there will be big implications for marine industries, some positive, some negative. Port capacity is going to be utilized and probably expanded in the region. Any kind of marine related building, shipbuilding, crewing. Municipalities would probably like to hear about what it means for them, and certainly in the communities where the energy might come on shore or it might be transformed into another form, such as hydrogen or e-fuels. There would be, obviously property taxation implications. But if your marine industries are thriving, that will be, I'm not here to talk you into this. I promise. I'm just, the emissions reduction potential is why I'm here. But there would be definitely some economic spin-offs, provincial revenues, federal revenues, and governments will be engaging in developing something called community benefit agreements. Are we familiar with community benefit agreements? I wasn't either. I'm only a few months in. I have a renewable energy background, but not offshore wind. Nobody has offshore wind experience in Nova Scotia because we haven't had any. But community benefit agreements can happen essentially at 2 tiers. The regulator for offshore oil and gas is probably transitioning into the regulator of offshore energy, and they will be applying regulations that Natural Resources and Canada is developing. And some of what might be required would be very formal community benefit agreements with criteria like local procurement, local labor. But those agreements can also happen at a much more local level between developers and stakeholders who can demonstrate that they're going to be impacted. And there can be agreements that help to compensate. For example, if some fishing ground was compromised or, travel distances were changed, then fishers can advocate through that sort of thing. Am I taking too long?
You're over your 10 minutes by a bit, but if you want to go to that last page quickly, you can do that if you want to skip.
Yeah, is that
just sort of like the conclusion page?
Oh, goody. Let's
Okay.
that bad. Okay. So key messages. Offshore wind energy is very low emitting. It's cost competitive, but it has to be paired with storage in order to be really successful at serving our needs. Nova Scotia has a world-class resource. Developers are very interested, but there's also a lot more demand for development than there is capacity to do it. There are very, very few ships in the world, for example, that have the capacity to install these turbines. And then the last key point is that this is a new industry in Canada. Regulations and bidding evaluation criteria are in development. So this is absolutely the time for people to make contributions to how this might evolve.
Thank you very much. Is there any questions from council? Councillor Sanford?
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I would be really interested in better understanding the impact on the marine life, the fisheries, and shipping. And I'm speaking from a Nova Scotia perspective when I say that. I heard you mention that Northern Europe has been doing this for 30 years and not having a good understanding of what fisheries they have. Are they comparable for us? Like, are there segments that would have comparable fisheries? And if so, do you have any understanding, if they've been doing it for 30 years, what the impact to their fisheries have been?
I have a little bit. And there's a really good information source called TETHYS, where they're consolidating research into renewable energy implications from around the world. My understanding is that in some areas where they developed wind farms that did not allow fishing in the same areas, I think those have tended to be revised because they realized that there wasn't a lot of incompatibility, but that won't be true for all fishing activities. So trawling would be an example of something that would not be very compatible because you just get stuck. Although I'm aware that there's some technology being developed in Yarmouth that will be using a lot of digital information to guide where trawlers go. So that could change. One of the things that's well documented is that there's something called a reefing effect and a reserve effect. So the infrastructure creates a small false reef, which tends to attract crustaceans and then their predators and then their predators. And so the wind fields have actually functioned to a large degree as reserves, where species can kind of regroup and reproduce. So it's not necessarily a net loss in terms of fishing intake, but it could drive costs up, for example. Just using my imagination, for some fisheries where they're doing a lot of short haul and start-stop, like the fishery, lobster fishery, electrification can be really, really cost effective because the fuel, electric fuel can be low. And there are local innovations around vessel to grid technology, whereby the vessels, when they're not operating during the off season, they can function as that backup storage that we need for more renewable integration. And, you know, part of a community benefit agreement could include some energy security, not only for fishers, but for the local community. But things like that are less likely to be included if we don't speak about them and ask for them. I hope that answered.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor Ernst?
Just wondering, especially to your point of where you said that this isn't something that is currently common in this part of the world. I'm thrilled with the idea that much of these windmills can be recycled. I'm just curious because the North Atlantic certainly is known for extreme winds at times. We experienced some of it just recently, where I believe the waves at George's Bank were recorded around 18 feet during storm during Lee. So just wondering the strength of these things and if they are able to withstand that. The very last thing we want to see is more junk in our oceans. So just want to see where if that's been taken into consideration and what these can withstand.
I have been a little remiss. So the process that I hope you'll engage with, the regional assessment of for the impact, will also be considering sort of what's Nova Scotia's effect likely to be on offshore wind. Exactly that. And I have tried to understand the answer to that question. The regulations of onshore technology require the engineering to be able to withstand sustained winds, I believe, of 60 kilometers an hour. I'm going to get it all mixed up. I wish I had more facts in front of me, but it looks as though the existing regulations are probably adequate for what we're used to getting. But we know that weather extremes are increasing, and so that's something that ought to be adjusted. And it is something that will be considered by the regional assessment.
Councillor Halverson?
Just wonder if you could explain, you mentioned that Nova Scotia Power's capacity is 3 gigawatts, and you mentioned that the field that you're talking about would be 3 gigawatts as well, but how large would that field actually be once it's up and running in the ocean?
Oh, I have known the answer to that question. Could I send that back to you? I would not like to use a number that's
Sure.
not correct.
Okay.
But it's you know, in square kilometers per gigawatt. And of course, it will depend somewhat on the site and the resource on site.
But it would be many square kilometers. No.
It's big.
Yeah.
It's really big. And the turbines are huge. Like, even though I've been looking at pictures of them, I recently saw one sort of modeled in the context of the Superport in Sydney, Nova Scotia. And I was shocked to find out it was to scale. And in a few days, we are going to take possession of a 3D printed model that they're producing for us at NSCC that will illustrate the scale of the wind turbines, because one of the big concerns and objections has been view plane. So we think immediately about the fishers. There are recreational users and travel industry users as well. And I did mention that there's the accord between the federal and provincial governments, and that will probably be the same regulatory group that looks at offshore energy. There are areas that I like to refer to as the near shore that are solely regulated by the province. And the province has been exploring interest among developers in offering leases within those areas. It's an iterative process. You might have seen some CBC coverage of it in the spring. My heart sank because those are the areas where there will be a lot of conflicted stakeholders. But that, you know, for example, St. Margaret's Bay and Mahone Bay fall under provincial regulation only. So we'll see if developers are interested in that and how seriously the province takes it. But that is also something that's been under discussion.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I look forward to hearing more information in the future. Thank you.
Welcome.
So next on the agenda, we have no correspondence. We have no public hearings or appeals. So we move on to 9.1, business arising and unfinished business. So 9.1 is a draft motion in front of us. Moved by Councillor Halverson. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Sanford. All those in favor signify by putting your right hand up. Is there any discussion on it?
I wouldn't mind just like having staff just give us a quick run
Yep.
through, just
One.
highlight it.
Through the chair, thanks for the question. Perhaps I'll give our municipal clerk, the author of the report, to give a brief overview.
Yeah, so what we have here is an amended occupational health and safety policy. So this came to our attention because for the town to keep its certification of recognition from Construction Safety Nova Scotia, they had said that we needed to amend our policy to include a section on record keeping. So while we went and reviewed that policy, we just thought it was a good opportunity to clean it up. So most of the proposed amendments that you're seeing here are very administrative in nature, even though it seems like we're getting rid of a lot of things. As you'll see, our current policy has a lot of sub-policies that are very procedural in nature. So they're not actually high-level policies of council that would affect our overall organization. They're standard operating procedures, mostly for public works. So what we are proposing is that we would repeal those policies, 46B through G. And that doesn't necessarily mean that these safety protocols disappear. Public Works will still review them with their director and with the CAO to make sure that things are being done in accordance with best safety practices. And then you'll see that we're proposing to repeal sub-policy 46A, which currently, as it states, is really like a terms of reference for our internal joint occupational health and safety committee. So rather than having to come back to the council table to make any amendments to those terms of references on how the committee operates, we're proposing that that comes out of the council policy and that any of those amendments would be approved by the chief administrative officer. And then the policy that you'll see there that you're being asked to vote on, it's very much in line with what was currently there. We've just cleaned it up and reformatted a little bit. So mostly administrative, but if you have any questions on anything being proposed there, I'd be happy to give some more detail.
Thank you, Kayla. Any questions for Kayla? Hearing no questions, all those in favor of the motion? All those opposed? Motion carried. So next on the agenda is 10.1, a land use bylaw amendment for Upper Hall Street rezoning. It's the first reading. I guess we'll get a motion on the floor first, and then we'll get Arthur to explain a bit about it. So do we have a motion on the floor? So moved by Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Halverson. Arthur, do you want to proceed, please?
Thank you, Your Worship. For the public record, my name is Arthur McDonald, and I'm the Director of Community Development. This is an application by Harborview Haven, who's looking for a new home. Having a long-term care facility in Lunenburg is considered a community asset and provides an opportunity for our aging population to continue living in familiar surroundings close to family members and their support networks. If they decide to move out of town, it would be considered a loss of a very important and long-standing facility in our community, which was established here in Lunenburg in 1971. Harborview Haven is interested in obtaining lands of Upper Hall Street to undertake a new 144-room long-term care facility. They have made an application to rezone the subject lands from industrial to institutional. Their application is provided in attachment A in the report. On September 11th, 2023, the Planning Advisory Committee held a public participation meeting to receive public input. No written submissions were received. Verbal submissions are reflected in the minutes of the Planning Advisory Committee, which are attached in attachment B of the report. Following the public participation meeting, the Planning Advisory Committee approved the following motion: to recommend that council proceed with first reading and advertise for a public hearing in order to consider, and if deemed advisable, approve an application to rezone Upper Hall Street from industrial to institutional use zone. And we're here for council to proceed with a motion for first reading with regards to that application. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Is there any questions for Arthur? Deputy Mayor Mosier?
Thank you, Worship. Through to Arthur. We're asking for rezoning from industrial to institutional. And is it any burden to include residential with that? And the reason I ask that is that, for instance, there's facilities that, full care facilities that have adjoining, assisted living areas. And lots of times, maybe if, your spouse might be in the full care facility and then they live in the, the assisted living area, it just makes it nice. Is that something that we can include in that? Is that something that needs to be, specified, or if it's required down the road, is that something that would be easily adjusted?
If those rooms were operated by the province through their license to operate a long-term care facility, then it will remain an institutional use. If you're talking about strictly residential uses, you would need an amendment to our municipal planning strategy. So right now, residential uses are not permitted within the future industrial designation on the future land use map. So this is just an application to amend the land use bylaw to go from industrial to institutional, which is allowed in the future land use map designation. Residential uses are not permitted in that designation. That would require an amendment to the municipal planning strategy. So that would be a decision of council down the road if it ever happened.
So this is a quick fix that could be later adjusted if that need was there, right? Is that how it would be? Because if we went for the full,
it would require a new application, a new public participation meeting, a new public hearing, a new decision of council and council's approval.
Thank you. Any other questions for Arthur? There are no other questions. All those in favor signify by raising your right hand. All those opposed, motion carried. Now we'll move on to 10.2, which is land use bylaw amendments, provisions for off-site signage, and it's the first reading as well. So we'll get a motion on the floor, and then we'll get, it says Trevor, but I'm going to get Arthur to explain this one.
Through the chair, yes, we'll have Arthur do an overview,
Okay.
and much like the last one, so it's an opportunity for clarity.
So we'll get a motion first, and then we'll do the motion. So moved by Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Bertels. Arthur, you're up again.
Thank you, Your Worship. Again, for the public record, my name is Arthur McDonald, Director of Community Development. We received an application from Salt Box Lightship Brewing Company has applied to amend the land use bylaw to enable the erection of an off-site ground sign next to their driveway entrance located at 93 Tannery Road. The applicant's proposal is attached in the report as attachment A. Several landlocked properties currently exist, served by the right-of-way easement from the public street. Some of these properties have businesses that would like to put up signage where their driveway meets the public road next to the public realm. Under the current land use bylaw and subdivision bylaw, landlocked parcels can no longer be created. This issue is thus limited to only those existing landlocked properties served by right-of-ways. The municipal planning strategy, section 5.5, covers signage. It establishes policy 5-7 and policy 5-8, which enables the land use bylaw to set out regulations for signs within the town, including their placement, number, and size. It also empowers the land use bylaw to define categories of signs and signs that will be prohibited. When the land use bylaw was adopted back in September 22nd, 2021, it included a provision under section 7.84, which outlines the various types of prohibited signs. Section 7.8.4H prohibits signs advertising goods or services unavailable at the sign location. The intent of this provision is to prohibit off-site signs, and for most properties, this is a reasonable limitation. In the case of businesses such as Saltbox, located on a landlocked parcel, this provision excludes the ability to place signage at their driveway entrance next to the public thoroughfare. This report proposes the introduction of a notwithstanding clause amendment as outlined in attachment D to enable businesses on landlocked property served by a legal right-of-way easement to erect ground signs adjacent to the public street. On September 11th, the Planning Advisory Committee held a public participation meeting to receive public input. No written or oral submissions were received. Following the public participation meeting, the Planning Advisory Committee approved the following motion: to recommend the council proceed with first reading and advertise for a public hearing in order to consider, and if deemed advisable, approve proposed signage amendments to the land use bylaw as outlined in the planner's report. Therefore, we're here this evening for council's consideration for first reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Hearing the explanation, is there any questions or concerns?
I'm not sure if this is through to Arthur, or perhaps our CEO could take this one. Looking at this, and obviously they, I love what everyone's doing over there. I think they should have their signs up. My concern is when I look at where the sign is going to be placed, we're all aware how narrow Tannery Road is. That's a blind corner, and anything that's going to distract a driver at that point, including a sign, I have a serious safety concern with. When we've got people walking up there. I lived over there for a short time, and I can tell you people would walk up there 4 across, 11 o'clock at night in the dark, and the number of near misses. At any rate, I guess my concern is the safety issue. What I'm looking for is, when is that sidewalk going to be completed? Once we have the sidewalk done, I don't have a problem because there'll be safe passage through there. But until that happens, I'm very nervous about putting a sign in there.
Through the chair to Councillor Halverson. Yes, the Tannery Road sidewalk, I think it's been on every single meeting since I started. It is a long time coming, and we have been working with landowners to acquire the land required to build the sidewalk. I would suggest that we're nearly in a position to begin construction. We're working through a few legalities and purchase that are remaining, and hope to begin construction this year, so as soon as possible. I think from a perspective of safety, I would suggest that before any permits granted or any sign is erected, there would be some concerns of safety noted and rectified if whatever that may look like. Now, I think you see some renderings. I'm not sure if the sign would actually remain as exactly depicted, but I'm sure Art and his team would make sure any safety issues are rectified before it's constructed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, concerns? The only comment I'd like to make is just make sure it's not going up anywhere near where the new sidewalk's going, so we don't have to move it later. So, yeah. So no other questions?
I do actually have one more question. Oh, sorry, I meant to ask this earlier. The sign that we're in question here, I don't see any lighting on it. Is there a proposal to have this lit? Has that been addressed by the proponent?
Through the chair, their application does not include a lit sign at this time. Not to say that they may change their application in the future, but currently it's just a ground sign that's not illuminated.
Okay, no other questions or concerns? All those in favor, raise your right hand. All those opposed, motion carried. And 10.3 is basically there for information only. If anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to make, they can. If there is none, we'll move on to 11. Oh, Deputy Mayor Moser, sorry about that.
Thanks, Your Worship. Just through to Arthur, there just seems to be a significant drop, year over year in our build rates. Is there any insights behind that, or that you could, share with us?
Through the chair, we average roughly 100 development permits a year, so we're really right on track. We're halfway through and we have 58 permits that have been issued. There is less with regards to dwelling unit counts because of last year we had a couple very large apartment buildings built. So we know there was 2 buildings with 5 units each, so they had like a 10 units under one permit. So I hope that addresses your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to 11, notice of motions, information and requests. And 11.1 is the Lunenburg community grants for Lunenburg students. Notice of motion provided by Councillor Sanford, and there's a draft motion there. So I'm looking for Councillor Sanford.
So the motion states, and thank you for putting the motion together, that council directs staff to amend the community grants program policy to include a criteria section specifically for students who live in the town of Lunenburg who require additional funding for recreational or cultural opportunities at a provincial or national level. And that $2,000 from the total annual community grants fund be used solely for student applicants who meet these criteria. So my thinking in our last meeting was, given the application that we had from Abby Chisholm, it prompted me to think that it would be, I think, really relevant for us to put in place a mechanism for students that live in the community, the opportunity to apply for a portion of our community grants fund. And in thinking that, the only addition I would make to this particular motion or suggest would be that it be noted that it would be available fiscal year for a complete fiscal year, as opposed to, I think they currently end at a certain point in time. But because of how the school years operate and in thinking about the budgets and when certain events happen and also cultural events happen at different times, it might be in a student's or an individual's, a youth's best interest if they were able to apply for this throughout the year. So thank you to staff for putting that motion together. Any other thoughts or comments from other colleagues?
My only comment is I think Modal has one that they hold so much money back, and they have a couple of times a year you can apply. So here I think even back when I was on 13 years ago, if you spent all your community grant money at budget time, it was gone. And that doesn't make a lot of sense because for school, for example, you have almost a whole school year the following year. So I agree with Councillor Sanford. If there's any way to put maybe 2 or 3 different periods in there that you can apply for the fund might make a bit more sense. Deputy Mayor Mosher and then Councillor Halverson. He just beat you. No, he didn't.
I'm closer.
Before beauty.
Yeah. Thanks, Your Worship. I assume that would have been implied that money is open throughout the fiscal period for application. So it's good by me.
Councillor Halverson.
He just said what I was going to say first.
Any other questions, concerns? So I guess we need a motion and a seconder. So moved by Councillor Sanford, seconded by, I'll give that one to you, Councillor Halverson. Okay, all those in favor, raise your right hand. All those opposed, thank you very much. Now we'll move on to 11.2, Lunenburg RV Park and Campground Financial Benefits. Notice a motion provided September 12th by Councillor Halverson. So I'll, Councillor Halverson, you want to go ahead?
Great. Thank you. Again, as I mentioned at our last meeting, there's been a lot of talk about the amount of benefit being received by the campground. That's a benefit that no one else gets in the rest of this province. I've done not against it, but I would like to see, when anyone else applies for a grant, they have to provide financials. We haven't really seen that, so I just think it's due diligence to make sure that if we're going to bequeath that much money on behalf of the town understands why it's going that direction. So thank you to staff for crafting the motion, and I will make the motion that council direct the CAO to request detailed financial statements from the Lunenburg Board of Trade regarding any data related to the financial and community benefits that the Lunenburg RV Park and Campground provides to the community. I will ask for a little clarity of our CAO. This motion, will you be collecting the data and presenting the information, or is this a request to have the Board of Trade representatives come here and present the data? And that might be better because then they can answer any questions we may have.
Thank you, Councillor Halverson. It's certainly open-ended to do either one of those. I have a very good relationship with the executive director and the previous executive director. What I would intend to do is have some conversation with them about the data requested. And of course, as we gather it, invite them to a council meeting to present this data so they can answer questions council may have. I think it would be a disservice to have me there answering questions on things I may or may not know. So I think it's only prudent that we have them come present as well.
Okay, so I guess if we present this motion as written, that's with the assumption that the Board of Trade will be invited to come and present and answer questions.
Through the chair to Councillor Halverson, that's certainly my intention.
All right, thank you. Well, then I'll move the motion as written.
Okay, it's been moved. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Deputy Mayor Mosher. Any other further discussion, questions? All those in favor, raise your right hand. All those opposed, motion carried. And 11.3 on the agenda is Blockhouse Hill engagement sessions, especially there, once again, for information or discussion at this point. If any councillor would like to have any questions, or with the staff that were there, any discussion, now's your time. If there isn't any, I'll move to go in camera and then call a quick recess. Motion by Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Sanford to go in camera. Thank you very much, folks. A motion to approve the 2 names we approved for the audit committee. Moved by Councillor Halverson, seconded by Deputy Mayor Mosher, and the names are Dan Steele and Gail Fullerton. All those in favor, raise your right hand. All those opposed. Now we'll move to PAC, where there was 3 positions available, and we'll need a motion to approve the 3 people we accepted. Moved by Councillor Sanford, seconded by Councillor Bertels. And the 3 names that it's Irma Desai, Alex Greek, and Kush Patha. So all those in favor, signify by raising the right hand. All those opposed. And then we'll move on to HAC, where there was 1 position. So all those in favor, Stephen Ernst, second by Susan. So the name that we're approving is Philip Mitchell. So so those are our committee appointments, and I thought we did, but okay, all those in favor of Philip Mitchell, all those opposed, okay. So again, thank you very much. Those are the committee appointees for the next 2 years. And I guess as a town, I'd like to thank everyone that submitted their names. I think this was the most names we've ever had for the committee appointment. So it made our job much more difficult, but it was great to see so many applicants. So thank you very much, everybody. And very qualified applicants. We were in this discussion for quite some time, whereas years we were probably begging people to sign up. So thank you very much. It says something to the community for having that many qualified people wanting to participate in our council decisions and discussions. So again, thank you, everyone. And now motion for adjournment. So moved, Councillor Sanford, seconded by Councillor Bertels. Okay, we're done. Thank you, everyone.